Imagine waking up to find your campsite empty, your fellow travelers gone without a trace. The serenity of nature suddenly feels suffocating. Every shadow a potential threat. This isn't the plot of a horror movie. It's the reality I faced during a wilderness trip gone wrong. In the next few minutes, I'll take you through my harrowing experience, exploring the thin line between solitude and isolation, and the primal fear that emerges when you realize you might be prey rather than just an observer in nature's grand design. Let me back up a bit. My name is Emma Carter, and I'm a photographer. Or at least, I want to be. This trip was supposed to be my way of hitting the reset button, shake off a bad breakup, capture some breathtaking shots, and maybe even find myself again. That's the story I told myself anyway. The campsite seemed perfect. Quiet, secluded, just the way I like it. There were 8 of us, strangers who signed up for the same guided excursion. We weren't exactly close, but it was comfortable enough. Every night we gathered around the fire, swapping stories and laughing like we'd known each other for years. And every morning we woke to birdsong and the crisp, clean scent of pine. That was before the first tent disappeared. Pause, as if hesitating. It was Amy and her fiancé, David. I didn't know them well. They kept to themselves mostly, sharing shy smiles and inside jokes. But that morning, their tent was gone completely. Not just flattened or torn like a bear had gotten to it. Gone. As if it had never been there. We found claw marks in the dirt, deep ones. Too big for any animal I've ever seen. The guide, Matt, tried to calm us down, said it was probably a prank or some sort of misunderstanding. But the look in his eyes, he didn't believe that. Not for a second. That night, as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I told myself it was nothing. An overactive imagination, fueled by too many campfire horror stories. But when the wind howled, I thought I heard something else. A low growl, distant but unmistakable. Lower voice, more urgent, and then the second tent disappeared. If you're still with me, here's where things get interesting. Stick around until the end, and I'll tell you what I saw with my own eyes. What it really was. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. When the second tent vanished, it wasn't as easy to dismiss. This time, it was Theo and Marcus, 2 experienced hikers, guys who prided themselves on knowing how to handle the wild. They were supposed to be the ones telling the rest of us what to do if anything went wrong. But when we woke up, they were just gone. No gear, no supplies, just those same claw marks in the dirt where their tent had been. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe they'd left in the middle of the night. An emergency, a wrong turn, something logical. But the way their campsite looked, it was too clean, no sign of panic, no footprints leading out into the woods, just those marks. Long, jagged grooves carved deep into the earth, like something had dragged the tent away. Matt, our guide, insisted we stay calm. He promised to radio for help, but the static on his handheld only made it worse. Every time he pressed that button, I could see the frustration on his face, the silent acknowledgement that we were completely cut off. We spent the day pretending things were fine, trying to act normal. Some of us went on a hike, snapping photos of the landscape like tourists. Others stayed behind, building up the fire and keeping busy. But the silence hung heavy over us. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig felt like a warning. That night, no one laughed around the campfire. Instead, we sat in a tight circle, our backs to the flames. The light felt like it barely reached beyond the edge of the clearing, and the dark, it seemed to press in closer. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every noise outside my tent felt amplified, like the forest was alive, holding its breath. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A heavy shuffle, breathing, low, guttural, and impossibly close. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I held my breath, listening. hoping it was just the wind. But then I saw it through the tiny mesh window of my tent. A shadow, huge, hulking. It moved between the trees, slow and deliberate, and then it stopped, right outside Zach's tent. The next morning, Zach's tent was gone. You're probably wondering what I did next, how I survived, what I discovered about the thing that was hunting us. Keep listening. I'll tell you everything. By the time Zach was gone, the camp wasn't just scared. We were unraveling. Some of us wanted to pack up and leave, to take our chances on the trails back to the ranger station. Others insisted we stay put, build up the fire, and wait for rescue. I didn't know what was worse, walking blindly into the woods with it out there, or staying here like sitting ducks, waiting for our turn. But me, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That shadow, the way it moved, so deliberate. It wasn't hunting out of hunger, but for something else. I didn't say it out loud, but deep down, I knew we weren't dealing with a bear or a mountain lion. This was something different. That day, Matt finally admitted what we all suspected. He'd been trying to radio for help since the first disappearance, and nothing had gone through. The ranger station was miles away, and even if we made it there was no guarantee anyone would believe us. "We stick together," he said, his voice trembling in a way that made my stomach drop. "We'll figure this out." But the group was falling apart. Maya, the geologist, started talking about legends she'd heard. Old stories about a creature that guarded this land. She called it the Shadow Beast. Supposedly, it was bound to the mountain, cursed to hunt anyone who wandered too deep into its territory. "It's just folklore," she said. She didn't believe her own words, but the look in her eyes told a different story. Then there was Kevin. He was already packing his bag, muttering about how we were wasting time. "This thing, whatever it is, it's picking us off one by one. I'm not waiting around to be next." He was halfway to the trail when Matt blocked his path. "We leave together or not at all," Matt said, his voice firm for the first time since this nightmare started. Kevin shoved past him. But before he could disappear into the trees, Maya grabbed his arm. "You don't understand," she said. "It doesn't matter where you go. If it wants you, it'll find you." That night, Kevin's tent disappeared. But this time, there was something new, something worse. Blood. I don't know what it dragged away, but it wasn't just the tent this time. By now, you must be wondering, what would you do? Stay and fight, or run and hope the forest lets you go? Keep listening, because what happened next changed everything. The blood changed everything. Till that point, we could pretend. Tell ourselves it was just tents disappearing, people walking off into the night. But when we found the stains in the dirt, dark and congealed, reality came crashing in. Kevin didn't just leave, he was taken. That morning, no one spoke. We moved like ghosts, packing up our gear with shaky hands, eyes darting toward the woods as if it might leap out at any moment. The claw marks were deeper this time, and there were more of them, as if whatever was out there wanted us to know it had been there. Matt gathered us around the fire pit. His face was pale, his words clipped. "We're leaving," he said, his voice trembling. "Now, we'll stick to the main trail and head toward the ranger station. Everyone stays together, no exceptions." Maya shook her head. "That's a mistake. Staying here is a mistake," Matt snapped. But Maya wasn't talking to him anymore. She was staring at the claw marks, at the blood. "It's marking its territory," she murmured, almost to herself. "It wants us to run." That stopped everyone cold. "It's a predator," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "Running triggers the chase. If we stay, we might have a chance." Matt wasn't having it. "And what do you suggest? We sit here and wait for it to pick us off, one by one?" Maya didn't answer. She just stared into the fire, as if the flames held some kind of answer. I don't know why, but I sided with her. Maybe it was the way her eyes burned with conviction, Or maybe it was because running felt like giving up. Either way, when Matt and two others grabbed their packs and started toward the trail, I stayed behind. That night, there were only 3 of us left at the campsite. The forest felt different, still. Too still. Even the wind seemed afraid to move. We sat by the fire, backs pressed against each other. Weapons we barely knew how to use clutched in our hands. Maya whispered stories about the shadow beast, how it was bound to the mountain, cursed to hunt until its territory was empty. She said no one knew if it was human or animal or something in between. She said it didn't matter. You don't stop something like this, she murmured. You survive it. And that's when we heard it. The sound was low at first, like a distant rumble of thunder. Then it grew louder, a heavy thudding that seemed to shake the ground. Footsteps. No, not footsteps. Paws. It was circling us, staying just beyond the firelight. Every now and then, a branch would snap, or leaves would crunch. I could feel it watching us, studying us. Zach's hand tightened on his knife. If it comes closer, he whispered, we fight. But Maya shook her head. No, she said, we don't. Not yet. And then, it stopped. The sounds, the movement, everything. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice. Emma, I know what you're thinking. I would have thought the same thing. There's no way it could have spoken. But it did, I swear it did, and it knew my name. You want to know how? Why? Stay with me. You'll understand soon enough. The voice froze me. My name, spoken with a guttural edge, slithered out of the darkness like a living thing. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or the fire playing tricks with the echoes. But then it came again, louder this time. Emma! My heart hammered against my ribs as I clutched the flashlight tighter in my hand. Zach and Maya heard it too. I could see it in the way their faces drained of color, their eyes darting wildly between the trees. It knows your name, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Zach stepped forward, knife raised. It's a trick, he hissed. Don't fall for it. Whatever it is, it's trying to mess with you. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew better. That voice, it wasn't just calling me, it was drawing me. Pulling at something primal inside me, a thread I didn't even know was there. My legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to root me in place, but my mind screamed to run, to hide, to get as far away from that sound as possible. Then the fire flickered, its light dimming unnaturally. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, creeping closer to the edge of the campsite. And then I saw it, just for a moment, a flash of something moving between the trees. It was massive, hunched, its silhouette shifting like it didn't quite belong in this world. What the hell is that? Zach muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my pulse. Before anyone could answer, the thing moved again, faster this time. It was circling us, the sound of its heavy footfalls blending with the snapping of branches and the rustling of leaves. I tried to track it with my flashlight, but it was too quick, too unpredictable. 1 second it was behind us. The next it was to the left, then the right. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Stay in the light, Maya whispered, clutching a stick she'd wrapped in cloth and doused with lighter fluid. It won't come into the light. But as she spoke, the fire dimmed again, sputtering like a dying heartbeat. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't afraid of us. It wasn't afraid of anything. Then came the growl, low, guttural, and impossibly close. It vibrated in my chest, sending shivers racing down my spine. The creature stopped moving. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent. And then, with a deafening roar, it charged. Time slowed. I saw it, truly saw it, for the first time. A monstrous shape, larger than any animal I'd ever imagined, crashing through the undergrowth with terrifying speed. Its limbs were wrong, too long, jointed like a spider but with the muscular heft of a predator. And the face, or what I thought was a face, was a grotesque fusion of beast and man, eyes glinting with a sickly yellow glow. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as the firelight danced off its slick, matted fur. Zack roared, a defiant cry, and lunged forward with his knife raised high. For a moment, I thought he might actually stop it, might somehow hold his ground against this impossible thing. But it swatted him aside like he was nothing. One massive, clawed hand struck him across the chest, and he flew through the air, landing with a sickening thud against a tree. He didn't get up. "Zack!" Maya screamed, but her voice cracked as the creature turned its attention to her. She raised her torch, holding it out like a shield, the flames flickering wildly in the gusts of its approach. It hesitated just for a second, the firelight reflecting in its unnatural eyes. But then it let out a guttural snarl, as if mocking her attempt at defense, and lunged again. Maya thrust the torch forward, and the flames kissed its fur. The creature recoiled with a hiss, the smell of burning hair and something far fouler filling the air. "Run, Emma!" Maya shouted, her voice desperate. I froze. My legs felt like lead, every muscle screaming to move, but I couldn't. The thing turned toward me, and for the briefest moment our eyes met. It knew me. Somehow, it knew me. Maya's scream shattered the moment. She had taken the creature's distraction as a chance to run, but it was too fast. With a horrifying snarl, it leapt, and she vanished beneath its massive bulk. I didn't wait to see what happened next. My body finally obeyed the primal urge to flee, and I bolted into the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms as I ran blindly into the darkness. Behind me, I could hear it tearing through the trees, its growls growing fainter but still too close for comfort. I didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs buckled, forcing me to collapse against the rough bark of a tree. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the distant echoes of its pursuit. But I wasn't safe. Not yet. I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. And I had no idea if I could survive until morning. I don't know how long I stayed slumped against that tree, my body trembling. Every breath a ragged gasp. The forest felt alive around me, a looming presence watching my every move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Why had it spoken my name? Why did it seem to know me? I forced myself to stand, leaning heavily on the tree for support. The weight of silence pressed down on me, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. I couldn't stay here. If I stopped moving, I'd die. As I stumbled through the woods, a faint glimmer caught my eye, a patch of pale moonlight breaking through the canopy. I followed it, my feet crunching on the dry leaves until I reached a clearing. At its center was something that stopped me cold, a circle of stones, old and weathered, arranged in a way that felt deliberate, ritualistic. In the middle of the circle, I saw an object gleaming faintly in the moonlight. A knife. Its blade was jagged and crude, its handle wrapped in something that looked disturbingly like sinew. It was ancient, and yet it seemed to hum with energy, as if it were waiting for me. I didn't want to touch it. Everything in me screamed to leave it where it lay. But as I stepped closer, the air grew thick, buzzing with a low vibration that pulled me in. My fingers brushed the handle, and a sharp jolt raced through my arm, filling my head with visions. Images of the creature, of blood, of fire and shadow. And then, a face. It was my grandmother. Her voice, soft but commanding, echoed in my mind. "You must finish what was started, Emma. The bloodline is the key. The bloodline. My bloodline." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing. It wasn't just hunting me. It was tied to me. I gripped the knife tightly, feeling its strange warmth seep into my palm. I didn't understand how, but I knew this was my only chance. I had to confront it, end it, for me, for Zach, for Maya, and for everyone who had vanished before us. A low growl cut through the night, snapping me back to the present. It was close. Too close. I turned to face the darkness, the knife trembling in my hand. "You want me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Come and get me." The growl deepened, and the trees around me seemed to shudder as it stepped into the moonlight. It was time to fight. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive frame illuminated by the pale light. Its eyes locked onto mine, gleaming with something that almost looked like recognition. This wasn't just a beast. It was something more, something ancient. I didn't wait for it to strike. I lunged first, the knife slashing through the air. The creature dodged easily, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so large. It countered with a swipe of its claws, and I barely managed to duck, feeling the wind of its attack brush past my face. The fight was chaotic, primal. It wasn't just strength against strength, it was willpower. Every swing of the knife, every dodge and stumble, felt like a battle, not just for my life, but for my identity. And then I saw it. A faint scar on its chest, running diagonally across its fur. The knife pulsed in my hand, and I understood. That scar was the mark of the blade. This was how it could be killed. The creature lunged again, and this time I didn't dodge. I stepped into its attack, driving the blade into its chest with everything I had. The sound it made was otherworldly, a mix of rage and pain that sent shivers down my spine. It stumbled backward, clawing at the knife as black ichor poured from the wound. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. "You're done," I whispered, watching as it collapsed to its knees. With one final agonized growl, the creature fell, its body crumpling into the dirt. For a moment, the forest held its breath, and then, slowly, the darkness lifted. I stood there, trembling, the knife still clutched in my hand. The clearing was silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind. It was over, but something told me this wasn't the end. The knife in my hand still pulsed faintly, a reminder that some things never truly die. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was barely coherent. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? The official report listed it as a tragic accident, but I know the truth. And as I sit here recounting this story, I can still feel the weight of that blade. Somewhere out there, the forest is waiting, watching. And so is it. That's my story, but it's not just mine anymore. The forest, the creature, the truth, they're all still out there, waiting. And just maybe, they're closer than you think. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, it's going to be a wild ride. The forest holds many secrets, some of which are never meant to be uncovered. We were just a group of friends looking for a peaceful getaway. But our camping trip took a sinister turn when we made a discovery that defied explanation. What we found hidden among the trees wasn't just unexpected, it was downright terrifying. Brace yourself as we recount the chilling tale of our encounter with something that should have remained hidden. We were packing up our breakfast when Jake, the most curious one among us, called out. He'd found something, a trail we hadn't seen before. It was barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of overgrown bushes. The odd part? It wasn't marked on any of our maps. I'll admit, I was the first to dismiss it. It's probably just an old deer trail, I said. But then we noticed the way the path cut sharply through the dense undergrowth, like it had been carved with purpose. It wasn't a deer trail, it was something else. What would you do? Would you ignore it and stick to your plans? Or would you follow it? We did what any curious group of friends might. We decided to explore. After all, what's the point of an adventure without a little risk? But here's the thing about risk. Sometimes it doesn't pay off. Sometimes it takes you somewhere you never intended to go. If you stick with me until the end, I'll show you just how far off the map we ended up. And I promise it's a story you won't forget. So we set off, laughing and joking as we stepped onto that mysterious trail. We didn't know it yet, but our adventure had already begun. At first, the trail didn't seem all that strange. The dirt beneath our boots was compact, as if it had been walked 100 times before. The trees formed an almost perfect canopy overhead, their branches twisting together like fingers interlocking. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but we didn't think much of it. I remember Jake leading the way, cutting through the underbrush with the excitement of a kid on a treasure hunt. The rest of us followed, laughing and teasing him for his enthusiasm. This better lead to something cool, I joked. But deep down, I was just as curious as he was. Still, not everyone was on board. Sarah, the cautious one in our group, hesitated. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her voice uneasy. "We don't know where it goes. What if it's private property or leads nowhere?" She had a point, but none of us wanted to turn back. There's something about the unknown that pulls at you, isn't there? That need to see what's waiting just around the corner. We told her it would be fine, that we'd keep track of our steps and turn back if we didn't find anything. It was a decision made quickly, casually, like we weren't walking into something bigger than ourselves. The deeper we went, the stranger it felt. The air grew heavier, thicker somehow, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional scamper of small animals, had disappeared entirely. And then we saw it. The trail stretched ahead, seemingly endless, cutting through the trees like a scar. But something felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of wrong you could explain. It was the kind that settled in your chest and refused to leave. "I think we should go back," Sarah said again, her voice sharper this time. Jake waved her off with a grin. "We've already come this far," he said. "Besides, that could happen. What's the worst that could happen? If only we'd known." But by the time we realized the truth, it was already too late. For now, though, we kept going, convinced we were in control. But, as you'll see, the trail had its own plans for us. Keep watching, because this is where things start to shift. And trust me, it only gets stranger from here. We must have been walking for hours, or, at least, that's how it felt. The trail never seemed to end. Every bend and twist looked the same, and the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Jake kept insisting we'd find something soon. "Maybe an old cabin or a hidden lake," he'd say, trying to keep our spirits up. But all we found was more trail. Then, just when we were starting to lose hope, we saw it. A clearing up ahead. Relief washed over us as we hurried toward it, expecting something new, something that would explain where this mysterious path led. But as we stepped into the open space, our laughter died in our throats. It was our campsite. At first, we didn't believe it. We thought it had to be some kind of coincidence. Maybe we'd accidentally looped back on ourselves, missed a turn somewhere. But as we looked closer, the details became undeniable. The same fire pit, the same folding chairs, even the remains of our breakfast still sitting on the logs. "How did we mess this up?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves it was just a mistake. After all, we'd been joking and not paying attention to our surroundings. It was easy to imagine how we might have walked in a circle. "We'll do it again," Jake said confidently. "This time, we'll stick to the path and mark our way." So, we set off again, retracing the trail with more care, leaving small markers, sticks, rocks, anything to keep track of our progress. This time, we were sure we wouldn't end up back where we started. But when we emerged into the clearing once more, the markers were gone. And the campsite, it wasn't the same. The tents looked faded, like they'd been sitting there for years. The air was colder, and the trees around us seemed older, taller, as if they'd been growing for decades in the time we'd been gone. And then there was the silence. Absolute, suffocating. No one laughed this time. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, panic rising in her voice. Jake didn't answer. None of us did. Because deep down, we all knew something was wrong. But we weren't ready to admit it yet. Instead, we convinced ourselves to try again, to find some logical explanation for what was happening. We didn't realize that with every step we took, we were walking deeper into something we couldn't escape. You see, the first loop was just the beginning. It was the trail's way of toying with us, drawing us in. And if you think this was unsettling, wait until you hear what came next. It wasn't just the forest that changed, it was us. By the third loop, we knew something was terribly wrong. We weren't just retracing our steps, we were being pulled into something far beyond our understanding. Each time we walked the trail, it seemed to twist a little more, like it was alive, shifting and reshaping itself while we weren't looking. When we came back to the clearing again, our campsite was barely recognizable. The tents were shredded, their fabric flapping in a wind we couldn't feel. Our belongings were scattered, and the fire pit was filled with ashes, as if it had been cold for years. But it wasn't just the campsite. The forest itself had changed. The trees loomed taller, their trunks scarred with strange symbols that hadn't been there before. The ground was littered with leaves that crumbled to dust when we touched them. Even the air felt heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. Sarah was the first to break. She wanted to leave, to turn back and abandon the trail. But that's when we realized the truth. There was no back. The trail didn't lead anywhere. It just kept looping. Jake tried to keep us calm, insisting there had to be an explanation. "We're just tired," he said. "We're seeing things because we're overthinking it." But even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes when we stumbled across the first marker we'd left. The sticks and rocks we'd used to trace our path, now rearranged into an eerie, deliberate pattern. It wasn't random. Someone, or something had been here, watching us. The whispers started that night. At first, we thought it was the wind, carrying faint, distant voices. But as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, circling us, pressing in from the darkness. They weren't speaking any language we could understand, but the intent was clear. We weren't welcome here. By the next loop, the trail wasn't just leading us in circles, it was showing us things. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, shapes that disappeared the moment we turned to look. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't watching, their branches reaching out like claws. And then there were the sounds. Twigs snapping, footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. We were trapped, caught in a nightmare that grew darker with every step. But the scariest part? It wasn't just the forest that was changing, it was us. Jake, the fearless leader, had gone quiet, his confidence replaced by a haunted, distant look. Sarah was on edge, jumping at every sound, her breaths coming faster and shallower with each passing hour. And me? I could feel it too. A creeping dread, like the trail was burrowing into my mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear. This wasn't just a trail anymore. It was a predator, and we were its prey. But the worst was yet to come, because with each loop, the trail revealed more of itself and more of us. And when it finally showed us what it wanted, there would be no turning back. It happened during the fifth loop. By then, none of us trusted each other anymore. Every sound felt like a threat, every shadow an enemy. The forest had twisted itself into something unrecognizable, a labyrinth of gnarled trees and shifting paths. But the clearing was still there, waiting for us at the end of every circuit, more decayed and terrifying each time. This time, it wasn't just the campsite that had changed. The ground was torn up, as if something massive had clawed its way through. Our belongings were strewn everywhere, but they looked wrong. The once bright colors of our tents were now dull and faded, and Jake's backpack was sitting upright in the middle of the clearing, its straps neatly folded like someone had placed it there deliberately. But Jake was gone. We had all been together, walking single file along the trail, when we realized he wasn't behind us anymore. We called his name, our voices echoing into the silence, but there was no answer, just the oppressive weight of the forest bearing down on us. Sarah broke down, tears streaming down her face as she screamed for him. I tried to keep calm, but deep down, I knew something had taken him. Jake wasn't the type to wander off. Whatever had been stalking us, whatever was rearranging our markers and twisting the trail, it had finally made its move. And then we saw it. A shadow, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the trees. It stood just at the edge of the clearing, motionless, watching. It didn't move when we called out. It didn't make a sound. It was just there, a silhouette that felt impossibly wrong. It didn't belong in this world. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over her sobs. "Now." But where could we go? The trail only led in circles, and going back was impossible. We argued, our voices sharp and panicked. Sarah wanted to run into the woods, off the path entirely, but I stopped her. The thought of leaving the trail was worse than the thought of staying on it. And that's when we heard Jake's voice. It came from deeper in the forest, faint and distant, calling for help. It was him, I was sure of it, but there was something off about it. A strange echo, like his words were being pulled apart and stitched back together. Sarah wanted to run toward it, but I grabbed her arm. "Listen to it," I said. "Really listen." The voice called out again, and this time it didn't sound like Jake at all. That's when I knew. Whatever was out there wasn't just toying with us. It was drawing us in, playing on our fears and our desperation. It wanted us to come closer, to leave the trail and step into its world. We didn't. Not yet. Instead, we huddled together in the clearing, trapped by our own fear, waiting for the morning that never came. The forest had no sense of time anymore, just an endless, suffocating night. But the trail wasn't finished with us. And what it showed us on the next loop, it broke us. Completely. We didn't know it at the time, but the 6th loop was going to be the last. Not because we found a way out, but because the trail finally revealed its purpose. By now, everything about the forest was wrong. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their bark cracked and oozing a dark, sap-like substance. The air smelled of decay, and the ground beneath our feet felt soft, like we were walking on something that had once been alive. The clearing, when we reached it, was almost unrecognizable. Our campsite was gone. In its place stood something else, a circle of crude wooden effigies arranged around a fire pit that burned without fuel. Each figure was twisted, misshapen, and eerily familiar. That's when I realized. They looked like us. Sarah screamed. She stumbled backward, pointing at the effigy closest to her. It wasn't just shaped like her. It was wearing her jacket, the one she'd been missing since the 2nd loop. And then we saw them. At the edge of the clearing, they stood in perfect stillness, figures that looked exactly like us. They had our clothes, our faces, even our movements, at least at first. But as we watched, they began to shift, their features warping into something grotesque. Their eyes were too wide, their smiles too sharp, their movements too fluid, like they were imitating us but didn't quite understand how humans were supposed to look. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But where could we go?" The trail only led back here, and the woods beyond felt like a trap of their own. And then it happened. One of the figures moved forward, stepping into the clearing. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. A perfect reflection, down to the rip in my jeans and the sweat-stained shirt I'd been wearing for days. It didn't speak. It didn't blink. It just stared, a hollow, lifeless version of myself. "Don't move," I whispered to Sarah, my heart pounding in my chest. But she didn't listen. She ran. I don't know what I expected to happen, but it wasn't this. As soon as she left the trail, the forest seemed to swallow her whole. She disappeared into the trees, her screams cutting off as if she'd never been there at all. And then, one by one, the figures stepped forward, circling me, their faces twisted, their eyes gleaming with something that wasn't human. I don't remember how I escaped. Maybe the trail let me go. Maybe it wanted me to tell this story, to warn others. All I know is, when I woke up, I was lying on the edge of the forest, alone, with no sign of Sarah, Jake, or anyone else. But sometimes, late at night, I hear them, the whispers, the footsteps, the sound of my own voice calling out from the shadows. So, if you ever find a trail that isn't on the map, turn around. Don't follow it. Because once you're on it, you'll never really leave. If this story sent a chill down your spine, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the unknown. Who knows? Maybe next time it'll be your story we uncover. Stay curious, but stay safe, because some paths are better left unexplored. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine in the middle of the woods? Even on a warm day? That inexplicable feeling that you're not alone, despite the seemingly empty forest around you. I never believed in such things until one fateful day when my peaceful hike turned into a heart-pounding encounter that I'm still trying to make sense of. It started as a simple plan. Just me, my tent, and a weekend away from the city. The endless noise, the honking cars, and the glowing screens had been suffocating me. I needed this. Time to clear my head, to hear nothing but the whisper of the wind and the crackle of a campfire. The place I picked was remote, deep in the forest, far from any marked trail. It was perfect, or so I thought. The sun dipped low as I set up camp, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The forest seemed alive, but in a way that felt off. The trees loomed tall, their branches curling like fingers. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the river flowing, but the sound was faint, almost like it didn't want to be found. As I sat by the fire that first night, I felt a strange comfort, but also an unease I couldn't quite shake. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're sure someone's standing just behind you, but when you turn around, nothing's there. Stay with me until the end, and I'll tell you the one thing I wish I'd known before I stepped foot in those woods. It might just save you from making the same mistake. That first night started peacefully enough. I had my tent set up, my fire roaring, and the stars above seemed close enough to touch. The forest around me was a symphony of crickets and rustling leaves, a natural lullaby that made me feel strangely at ease. For a while, I just sat there, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. But then, I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost too soft to notice, like a whisper carried by the wind. I paused, leaning forward, straining my ears to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the creak of a tree. It was something else. I shook it off. Probably just an animal, I told myself. This was the wilderness, after all. Things moved, things made noise. Still, the unease lingered. I tossed another log onto the fire, telling myself it was nothing. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was exhausted. The forest had grown eerily quiet, but I figured the firelight had scared off any curious critters. I zipped myself in and lay back, trying to convince myself to sleep. And then, in the dead of night, I woke up. Something was moving outside the tent. It wasn't just footsteps, it was slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was circling me. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining the light into the darkness. Nothing. The forest was too still. The moment I crawled back into the tent, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint scratch on the tent fabric, right next to where my head had been. The next morning, as the sun rose, I found more. Footprints in the dirt, but they weren't mine. Whatever it was, it had been close, too close. The unease from the night before lingered as I packed up my things and decided to explore the trails nearby. I thought moving around might help me shake the feeling of being watched, even if I couldn't quite explain it. About an hour into my hike, I met someone, an older man with a scruffy beard and a weathered backpack. He was standing near the edge of the trail, looking like he was deciding whether to move forward or turn back. He noticed me and waved, his expression friendly but tired. "Not many people come this far out," he said, his voice gravelly. "You camping alone?" I nodded, feeling a little wary. Something about him seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Just needed some quiet," I replied, forcing a smile. The man chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Quiet isn't always a good thing around here." He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something or someone. "You should leave before nightfall." The words sent a chill through me. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my stomach tightened. He shrugged, but his eyes told a different story. "Strange things happen in these woods. People go missing. Animals turn up mutilated. Some say the forest doesn't like visitors staying too long." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Sounds like campfire stories to me." He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Just be careful. If you hear something at night, don't go looking for it." With that, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked off, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to pack up and leave, but I wasn't ready to cut my trip short over some cryptic warning. At least, not yet. If only I'd known how much I'd regret that decision. By the time night fell again, I had convinced myself that the old man's warning was just a weird attempt to scare me. Maybe he was superstitious, or maybe he enjoyed creeping out anyone who ventured this far into the forest. Either way, I wasn't about to let his words ruin my trip. The fire crackled as I sat outside my tent, trying to relax. The woods were quieter than the night before. Too quiet. There was no wind, no distant animal calls, just the occasional pop of the firewood. I kept glancing over my shoulder, telling myself it was just my imagination. And then, the noises started. At first, it was soft, like the faint shuffle of leaves. I froze, listening, my pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, closer, as though something or someone was moving around my campsite, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking as I pointed it toward the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. Then came a loud thud, like something heavy had been dropped just outside the circle of firelight. My breath hitched as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but again, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just a falling branch, though deep down, I knew better. The fire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. And then, as if on cue, the fire suddenly died out, plunging me into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for more wood to reignite it. The noises around me grew louder now, footsteps circling the campsite, whispers that seemed to echo from all directions. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but the whispers, they sounded human. I didn't sleep that night. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. When dawn finally broke, it felt like I'd survived a siege. But the worst part was yet to come, and I had no idea what was waiting for me. The moment the first rays of sunlight hit the forest, I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the tent poles. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself didn't want me to leave. I headed down the trail I'd come in on, but something was wrong. The path seemed different. Trees I swore I'd passed before now looked unfamiliar, their twisted branches forming strange shapes that almost seemed deliberate. My compass was no help either. It spun aimlessly, as if mocking my attempt to find my way out. And then I saw it, an abandoned campsite, just off the trail. The sight made me stop in my tracks. There were 2 collapsed tents, their fabric torn and faded, and a rusted camping stove tipped over on its side. It looked as though no one had been there for years. Curiosity got the better of me. As I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scattered among the debris were items I recognized: an old water bottle, a flashlight, and even a torn map. These weren't just random belongings. They were mine. My knees nearly gave out as I stared at the scene. How could my gear be here when I'd had it with me the whole time? My backpack felt impossibly heavy now, like it was filled with something far more sinister than supplies. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was following me. Panic took over as I bolted back to the trail, running as fast as I could. But no matter how far I went, it felt like I was going in circles. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting, trapping me in its grasp. I screamed for help, but the sound barely echoed before the trees swallowed it whole. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take. Whatever was chasing me was getting closer. I could feel its presence, its intent. It wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. My lungs burned as I stumbled through the forest, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The footsteps behind me had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting, and then I saw it. Just ahead, through the thick trees, a figure. At first, it looked like a person, standing completely still, backlit by the pale morning light. Relief flooded me. "Hey, help me!" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. The figure didn't move. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs refused to obey. Something about it was wrong. Its shape seemed to shift, its outline blurring at the edges, as if it wasn't fully there. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. Slowly, the figure tilted its head, the movement unnaturally sharp and quick. A low, guttural sound filled the air, a mix of a growl and a distorted whisper. It sent a chill down my spine like ice spreading through my veins. The figure took a step toward me, and that's when I saw its face, or lack of one. Its features were a void, a dark emptiness that seemed to pull everything around it. My flashlight fell from my hand as I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The air around me grew colder, heavier, like the forest itself was closing in. The whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping and chaotic, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. I scrambled to my feet, barely able to breathe, and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The figure didn't chase me, but its presence lingered, pressing against my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. By the time I found the edge of the forest, the sun was high in the sky, but I felt no relief. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, I thought it was over. but as I looked back toward the trees, I saw them again. Not one, but several figures, standing just beyond the shadows. Watching, waiting. I didn't stop running until I was miles away. Even now, I can't escape the feeling that I didn't leave the forest. A part of me is still there, and something from it might have followed me home. I don't remember how I made it back to my car. My mind was a blur of terror and exhaustion. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop to catch my breath or look back. I just drove. I drove as fast as I could, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see something or someone chasing me. When I finally got home, the relief was short-lived. The first night back, I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. I told myself it was just my nerves, that I was safe now. But then, I started noticing things. Little things. My flashlight, the one I dropped in the woods, was sitting on my kitchen counter. A small tear appeared in my bedroom curtain, one that looked suspiciously like the scratch I'd seen on my tent. And then, there were the whispers, faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. They came at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. I told myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I don't go camping anymore. I barely leave my house. The forest may be miles away, but it's still with me. I feel it in the silence, in the corners of my vision, in the uneasy weight that never leaves my chest. So, if you ever find yourself craving solitude, think twice about where you go. Not every quiet place wants to be disturbed, and some places, they don't let you leave. If you enjoyed this story and want more spine-chilling tales, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button and share this video with your friends, because you never know who might need a warning like this, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next, if you dare.